covers college football for theathletic.com. Also, Mike Rodak, AL.com, covers Alabama men's basketball. We will have him momentarily as well. And then also at the bottom of the hour, Mickey Spagnola, his thoughts about the Dan Quinn story and really what were maybe some behind the scenes of whether or not he saw a job or two he wanted. They did not then hire him, and he said, hell, I'm staying with the Cowboys, and how positive a news that might be. And then Craig's off the radar in 30 minutes. Mike Rodak, AL.com, covers Alabama men's basketball. Mike, thanks a lot. Baylor and Alabama coming up Saturday, and, you know, a hell of a game. I saw where Alabama might be trying to do a whiteout, whatever it might do to continue to juice up that crowd. We mentioned something a day or two on this show. The wins that Alabama has are spectacular, and I know they have a recent loss to Auburn, but the losses are sometimes you scratch your head. Who are they, Mike?
That's a great question, because they've probably been one of the most inconsistent teams in America this season. It's pretty incredible, especially considering last year. They got better as the season went on last year, and it's really been the opposite this year. I think they've gotten worse. And, yeah, they go out and they beat Gonzaga. They beat Houston. And that Gonzaga game, too, was in Seattle, and that was in front of a crowd of 19,000 Gonzaga fans and probably 10 Alabama fans, and they played their best game of the year. And then, they lose at Georgia, they lose, at Missouri. It's just the team that I think is a little bit immature. They lack leadership. They don't have what they had last year in Herb Jones, who was a really just kind of level-headed veteran sort of player who became SEC Player of the Year, became SEC Defensive Player of the Year, and now is doing some pretty big things in the NBA for the Pelicans. And they missed that. They missed that sort of gritty player who just goes out and plays 40 minutes every night and doesn't care about the highlight reel or any of that stuff. And I think that a few of their guys are a little bit too fixated on what do I need to do to get to the NBA? What am I doing for the highlight reel type of plays and beating guys and getting dunks? And it's not team basketball. There's definitely a problem with effort. And it's just at this point in the year, we're on the doorstep of February. You kind of have to wonder what this team will be, the final month of the season. But right now, it's a lot of kind of disjointed, talented players who aren't playing very well together.
So is that why it's so befuddling that they are giant killers when it comes to playing some of these big teams?
Well, I think they get up for those games, and I think that especially the home games where the crowd kind of gets behind them and there's some energy and there's sort of that oomph that they need to just go out and play really well and play to their capability. That's when they beat Gonzaga, they beat Houston at home, they beat LSU at home, they beat Tennessee at home when Tennessee was in the top 15. So they get the crowd behind them. That I think definitely helps. And their home record is very good. They lost at Auburn a couple weeks ago, and that was a pretty close game, down towards the end. Other than that, that was their first loss at home in over a year. You go back to December of 2020. So, I guess the saving grace for this Alabama-Baylor game on Alabama's end is that it's at home, and you have that crowd, you have the energy. It's a Saturday game, which does make a difference, crowd-wise in Tuscaloosa, because a lot of their fan base is coming from Birmingham, which is over an hour away. You play a weeknight game, the crowds there are just not great. Because people aren't going to drive an hour both ways for a weeknight game. But a Saturday game, you're looking at a much bigger crowd, and I think, that definitely gives them some energy.
What are your thoughts right now on the current landscape of the SEC? I mean, Auburn's obviously having a lot of success, a lot of attention being placed on them, but Kentucky obviously is always going to be in the mix. It's a pretty tight grouping. I mean, only a couple of games separating teams for the most part. What are your thoughts about just the way the conference is set up at this point?
Yeah, I mean, Auburn seems like they're in the driver's seat, especially having beaten Kentucky. Alabama still can't be completely counted out just because they still have some games. They have another game coming up against Auburn. They have two games coming up against Kentucky. They've already beaten LSU. They have another LSU game coming up, and they've already beaten Tennessee. So they have the wins that I think they would need if they got into a tiebreaker situation, or they could get those wins if they kind of turn things around. So you can't really discount them. But I think at the end of the day, it's probably going to be Auburn or Kentucky up at the top as far as, regular season championships. And, I think Alabama still has some sort of hope that they can get HUD in the tournament. Nate Oates was talking to his team after they lost to Georgia and brought up UCLA last year. And not that they they didn't do anything in the Pac-12 tournament, but in the NCAA tournament, they kind of turned things around and they ended up beating Alabama when Alabama was a 2 seed in the Sweet 16 and obviously went to the Final Four. So that's kind of his hope, is that his team can kind of be a late starter and, kind of pick things up by February or March. And I wouldn't totally rule them out of the SEC right now.
Yeah, wins against Gonzaga, Houston, LSU. Losses, Auburn, obviously, number one. And then Iona with Patino, right? Obviously a team they beat in the NCAA tournament. Did last year's season, even with those, as you mentioned, they lost, did that launch people's expectations that they would just go back and do it again this year? And has it been then a little bit disappointing?
Definitely, yeah. I think that was one of the things that Nate Oates was trying to guard against, even beginning of the season when he was talking about what was going to happen with the team. He basically said, look, like what we did last year was very good for what the Alabama standard has been. They won their first SEC tournament in 30 years. Doesn't mean it's going to happen every year, especially when you lose basically their top 6 players from last year, or at least their 6 most veteran players from last year is what they lost. Ended up going either to the NBA or played overseas. So that's going to hurt, especially as we found out now from kind of a leadership and maturity standpoint. That's probably where it even hurts even more. Even if you have the talent coming up behind them, can't really easily replace that right away. So that's kind of been the situation. But, at the end of the day, I think fans are still overly, the overall picture, still happy with where Oates has brought the program compared to where it was before. They still have, I think, a top 3 recruiting class coming in next year. They have 2 McDonald's All-Americans that they signed in November. So, I think the future is still bright, but they kind of have to figure things out right now in the short term.
What's a success in the next 3? 1-2 or 2-1 when it's Baylor, Auburn, Kentucky?
I think if they can win one of them, then they're in decent enough shape, just because their schedule does lighten up a little bit in February, where I think they have Ole Miss, South Carolina, A&M, where they can win. If obviously, who knows with the way they played, but they could win all those games and then kind of put themselves in a position to make a run later on. If they go 0-3, I think people are really going to start to tune out around here, because the hope all along has been, all right, well, they play well against good teams. If you don't play well against these next 3 good teams, then, I think people are going to be looking forward to next year. But I think if they can get one out of the 3, then they're going to be in a decent enough spot here.
Mike, I don't know how much you've been able to see Baylor this year, but just in terms of what you do know about them, your thoughts on how they match up with Alabama?
Yeah, I haven't seen a ton, but I'd say if you're trying to beat Alabama, you got to play them with a big man, and you got to play them really tough. If you can out physical Alabama, that's kind of been their weakness this year as far as rebounding, effort plays, all that stuff is just kind of where teams punch them in the mouth. And these guys they don't have that DNA to kind of punch back. So I don't really know exactly where Baylor falls on that spectrum of, just gritty and toughness, but it's been those sort of teams that have really gotten Alabama this year. And I think that's kind of their weakness. And look, if Alabama's not shooting, which they haven't been all year, I mean, they're 294th in the country in 3-point percentage, then they really got to win someplace else. And last year they won with their defense when they weren't shooting. This year their defense just hasn't been there to the same level. So that's really been their problem. Yeah,
and the grittiness and the toughness is what Baylor has kind of now become, as far as they don't have the big, tall, lanky 6'10" guy, but they have a couple of guys that can move around pretty well. And I know Auburn's averaging 40 rebounds a game, Baylor 38, so that'll be interesting. And what Shackelford and Quinterly can do for Alabama. Mike, thank you very much. We appreciate it. The Alabama basketball last year, 3rd round, lost in overtime to UCLA, and yeah, they've had a tough little stretch here at the wrong time. And now, as Craig, you mentioned, Baylor, Auburn, and Kentucky back-to-back-to-back is pretty tough.
Yeah, I'd say so. And, yeah, thanks to Mike for his time. Yeah, it's not easy. I don't know what to say. That's tough. I mean, that's a bad schedule break to have those 3 teams lined up. And, Auburn's kind of running away with it. I mean, there's time and room for some other teams to maybe get their hands in the pot in terms of trying to pull away that SEC trophy. But right now Auburn's cruising. I mean, unbeaten in SEC play, and everybody else has got a couple of losses. I mean, Kentucky's got 2, then you got a handful of teams with 3
Bunch.
losses,
Yeah.
a handful of teams with 4 and 5 losses as well. So yeah, Auburn's in the driver's seat right now, unbeaten in conference play and just 1 loss on the year. So, it should be fun to see Bama and that atmosphere and that crowd, but it sounds like they're pretty desperate for a win. So Baylor go in there and take care of their business, get the job done, get back to Big 12 play. That'd be good for them, but that'd be a huge win for Alabama if they can pull it off and maybe launch them into something those next couple of games afterwards as well.
It does seem like the SEC is deeper. Yeah?
Deeper than the Big 12?
No. No one's deeper than the Big 12, but it's deeper than they have been for the most part. Yeah.
Yes, they're a better basketball conference right now, and they've been good, but I think that right now they're really, it's a lot more competitive.
It was usually for the last 6-7 years, it's been a top team, a second tier team, and then nothing. And now you got 5 or 6 teams that are all really good.
Well, Arkansas, remember, they made their run last year. Last year, Arkansas made their run before they were wiped out. Kentucky, of course. Now, A&M had a great start. They were unbeaten in the SEC. They've now lost 3 consecutive games to Kentucky, Arkansas, and LSU.
Yeah, and they'd really started
free
to
fall.
Build up. They were really starting to get some momentum for like home crowds and stuff. I was seeing more talk than ever before on my timeline about people going to the basketball games and, making it a great atmosphere and all of that. And, A&M fans are always going to be there to support. But it seems like they had gotten a little, excitement building up. And then, now they've gone on a little bit of a losing streak. And we'll see if they'll keep up that energy. But, Buzz Williams is a good coach. I'm sure they'll, give some people some problems along the way, the rest of this way. But, that was kind of rough for them to go on a little bit of a stretch where they weren't winning. But, the SEC is a fun conference. We'll see what happens this weekend. They took the last Big 12 SEC challenge, and this thing's kind of gone back and forth in the last few years that they've been doing this, and it's usually pretty fun to watch. So I'm definitely, interested in Tennessee and Texas and Bama, Baylor, and all the rest of those matchups will be fun.
Some of you on the chat room, a couple of you mentioned this, and then we'll take a break. Timothy, how do you beat Alabama? Have a shrimp boil in the locker room? Not sure what the hell that means. Gary Lewis, no verification. Tony Price, another great show. Thank you, gentlemen. You're getting me